Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca L. Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the US and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides. Welcome back, everyone. We hope you are enjoying your summer. During our own summer pausa, we wanted to share another student special episode with you. And next month, in August, we'll share a special bonus episode that I recorded at New York Comic Con in 2023. This summer, we've got 3 student episodes that we're going to share with you. And the courses represented in the content we're sharing come from Latin American Studies 1003, Latin America, an Institutional and Cultural Survey, and Latin American Studies 3012, Latinas, a Social and Cultural Survey. In these classes, students have the option of creating a podcast episode for their semester project. They're assigned to listen to podcasts throughout the semester and become accustomed to what they sound like. This helps them as they plan out how they'll present their own research in this medium. For some of these students, creating a podcast was something they had never done before, and we're really proud of them for stepping outside of their comfort zones and trying something new. At the end of the semester, we asked students who submitted their podcast projects for permission to share their research on this platform. The students you'll hear in this episode are those that gave us that permission. Their work is presented as they created it with very minimal editing for sound levels and similar such issues. We have not edited them for content. In this episode, we feature projects by LTS 1003 students Jasmin, Reyes, and Jose Perez, along with LTS 3012 student Ashanti Charon. First will be Jasmin's episode on gender-based violence in Haiti. She'll be shedding light on some of the different forms of gender-based violence in the country and will be addressing topics including intimate partner violence, violence after the 2010 earthquake, and more. Next, Ashanti will discuss the prevalence of sexism within Hispanic folklore and the role of women in Latinx monster stories. She considers why women are more frequently portrayed as monstrous in these stories than are their male counterparts. Finally, Jose looks into the relationship between the US and Cuba and the effects on the US trade embargo on the island, specifically as they relate to Cuba's economy and the impact on Cubans during the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So with just those brief introductions, we'll now let the students speak for themselves. Please enjoy their analyses and discussions.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time you are hearing this. My name is Jasmin Reyes, and I am taking the class Latin Studies 1003 with Professor Dr. Rebecca L. Solis. Today, I will be speaking about critical issues impacting communities worldwide. Today, we shine a spotlight on Haiti and the pervasive issues of gender-based violence. So despite Haiti being a beautiful and culturally rich nation, it faces significant challenges. Gender-based violence is one of the pressing challenges that they face. From an article posted in 2005, according to Anastasia Gage, Haiti is one of the poorest and least industrialized countries in the Western Hemisphere. Its economic growth rate is between 1.3 and 2%. With over 60% of the population living in extreme poverty, and the majority do not have access to government or any resources at all. In exploring gender-based violence in Haiti, this podcast aims to illustrate the dimensions of this pervasive issue, shedding light on the different forms in which gender-based violence is done in Haiti and the different ways that it manifests in the country. So firstly, I'll be speaking about gender-based violence related to intimate partner violence. So, firstly, I'd like to bring up the impact of when Haiti gained their independence. Haiti gained their independence from the colonial rule in 1804 and marked liberation. However, systems of inequality and violence persisted and often mainly affected women. Poverty, political instability, and economic hardship in Haiti contributes to a cycle of violence with women facing heightened risk, like what I mentioned previously. One piece of evidence, which is also from Anastasia Gage, she states, these variables are seen as indicators of stress in families, with violence being seen as a means of coping with stressful events. Large families can, for example, dilute parental energy and lower attachments to partners, thus increasing women's risk of experiencing intimate partner violence. There is some indication that the relationship between family size and domestic violence may be context specific. This quote shows how having a large family with no type of money or job in Haiti, it is already a primarily poor country, it is a very big risk factor for women, like Anastasia stated. Low level wealth, low socioeconomic status, children under the ages of 5, having a big family, it can increase stress in the relationships that these partners are having, which then results in using violence as a coping mechanism to manage or alleviate their emotional strain. Another piece of evidence from Anastasia Gage as well, she states that currently understanding suggests that women's experience of domestic violence is associated with a complex array of individual, household, dietic, and societal level factors. Studies have found that children who either experience violence themselves or witness violence between their parents are more likely to use violence when they grow up. This quote highlights the multifaceted nature of domestic violence, attributing women's experiences as stated to a combination of individual, household, dietic, and societal factors. Additionally, it underscores the integrational cycle of violence, noting that children who witness or experience violence are more inclined to perpetuate it in adulthood with their future partners. Nextly, we're going to move on to the next section, which is based on gender violence after Haiti's 2010 earthquake. So, for those that may not know, Haiti suffered a very tragic earthquake on January 12, 2010. It was about 7.0 magnitude earthquake, which left Port-au-Prince, Haiti's capital, destroyed, and it resulted in the death of about 300 million people. During the post-disaster era, because of Haiti's earthquake, the individuals were faced with many gendered issues like families fighting for their survival, violence and exploitation, and classes, as well as racially based stigmatization. So I firstly want to start by stating the definition of sexual violence. This is from an author named Reyes. He states that sexual violence is attempting to obtain a sexual act that is directed against a person's sexuality using coercion by any person regardless of their relationship to the victim in any setting. This includes rape, defined as physically forced or otherwise coerced penetration of the vulva or anus using a penis, other body parts, or an object. After the disaster that happened in Haiti, which in this case is the earthquake, women were at increased vulnerability to violence due to dispatchment after the earthquake. And then on top of this, Haiti having a lack of law enforcement and it being the poorest country that is oftentimes overlooked, women were at an even higher risk of experiencing sexual violence. From the same author, Rahel, he stated that the psychosocial consequences of violence perpetuated by intimate partners are well documented, revealing that in often occasions trauma and stress-related disorders in victims and survivors. Little is known about the psychological effects of sexual violence perpetuated by non-intimate partners, as indicated by a recent call from the World Health Organization for research on non-partner sexual violence, particularly mainly focused in poor and disastrous affected countries. This goes to show that extended research conducted by Rahel and other researchers documented the psychological toll of intimate partner violence and often resulting in trauma and stress-related disorders from the survivors. They also pointed out in this quote that there is a notable lack of understanding regarding the psychological impacts of sexual violence perpetuated by non-intimate partners. This gap, highlighted by the World Health Organization's recent call for research, This underscores the urgent need to explore these effects in Haiti and in other countries, particularly in areas, like I stated, that were very affected by natural disaster, the way that Haiti was. Moving on to a bit more contemporary information related to gender violence in Haiti. Like I've stated multiple times earlier, Haiti is the least developed country in the Caribbean, and it is also affected by sexual violence. A bit of quoted evidence from Sinat. Although the sexual violence phenomena is less studied in the Latin American region, the few studies showed that it continues to be a major health and social issue among children, adolescents, and young adults. A data study conducted by Sinat concluded that adolescent girls and young women, which is about 29.02%, are more likely than adolescent boys and young men. The percentage is 25.73%. To experience sexual victimization. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, sexual victimization is non-consensual sexual acts or abusive contact with the victim without his or her consent, or with the victim who cannot consent or refuse. The statistics provided above reveal a concerning pattern of sexual violence affecting adolescent and young women in Haiti. This shows the widespread nature of sexual violence in Haiti as well. The high prevalence of coerced and forced sex amongst adolescents and young adults in Haiti represents the urgent need for targeted intervention and comprehensive support systems heading into Haiti's way for these people. Additionally, these statistics likely underestimate the true prevalence of sexual violence in Haiti, as many cases probably go unreported due to any fear, shame, or lack of trust in the justice system that these individuals may face or feel. In Sanat's study, he says, lastly, this study reveals a strong association between sexual violence and mental health problems and substance abuse. The results showed that victims of sexual violence are 2.32 times more likely to meet criteria of PTSD, 2.02 times more likely to have depression and psychological distress, and 1.57 times more likely to use substance abuse. This association underscores the complex interplay between experiences of trauma and subsequent psychological distress and maladaptive copinisms like using drugs, hard liquor, which essentially manifests into what we're speaking about today, which is violence in Haiti that's going on. The statistics stated show the substantial risk posed by sexual violence of survivors dealing with this and their mental well-being. This highlights the need to target interventions aimed at preventing sexual violence and addressing its roots causing it in order to mitigate its impact of these individuals' mental health and to help the ones that are currently going through it. Like I've stated before, gender-based violence in Haiti is a pervasive issue that demands urgent attention and action. Throughout this podcast, we've explored the multifaceted nature of gender-based violence in Haiti, examining how different forms of violence were all connected and impact different individuals in Haiti. The data provided from the studies giving statistics showing how at risk the new generations living in Haiti is because of issues that are not dealt with and that never were dealt with as well. Raising awareness and advocating can create a future where individuals in Haiti do not have to go through things like this and are able to live free from violence. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Monster Stories. This episode, we're going to be focused on Hispanic folklore with your host, Ashanti. So, in today's podcast, we'll be talking about sexism within Hispanic folklore. Let's get into it. Hello, welcome back. So, while doing research, I've learned a lot about Hispanic folklore and a lot about how Hispanic folklore is sexist towards women. While growing up, in my personal stories, my family's only ever told me about women folklores. La Llorona, that she's going to come take me in my sleep if I don't go to sleep because, every parent will tell you that. Or just in general, hearing more about woman folklores than men. So while I was doing my research for this podcast, I've learned there are only 4. My research could be completely wrong, but the 4 I found were hombre, gamen, which is alligator man, which is part alligator, half man in his name, and it's official that he was a story that he was a fisherman, and then the spirits turned him into an alligator monster, and he hunts humans like fish. So then there's another one called Mona, Moan, which is, he's supposed to be described as short legs, extremely hairy, he loves mischief, and there are so many different versions of it, but the one version I found is that he steals women and he lives in a cave and he holds them captive. And another one is El Cebron. I might be butchering that. It's in Venezuela. It's about a son who commits a crime. He kills his father and he feeds his father, without knowing. And El Coco, or El Canco, which is another version of how to say it. He has like 2 different things. He's a monster that hides in the shadows underneath your beds and looking into closets to feed on disobedient children. I've never heard of these folklores before until I was doing research for this podcast and finding out how it's such a shame that there are only 4 men and there's so many women's Hispanic folklores. Like, you have La Llorona, which is supposed to be the weeping woman who takes children. You have oh wait, scratch that. I found another one while in my notes. I've also missed pink dolphins. I've never heard of it. It's technically, he's a pink dolphin. He feeds on people of the Amazon, and it says when the sun goes down, he turns into a beautiful man. Like I said, I've never heard these folklores before. I've heard La Llorona. I've heard Les Lega. I've heard so many different ones, but I've never heard of men until I started doing my research, which is surprising because 4 out of the many, many stories that are out there nowadays, and especially films that are getting converted from these movies, from these stories, it's crazy. So like in an article, Women Folklore, Women Culture by O'Connor, she literally quotes that folklore studies, then like anthropologist studies, have described men as women, seen or don't see them. A tendency to see the world in men terms have influenced what kind of data folklorists have looked for and from whom, and also what data they have actually collected and from whom. I took this quote in a tremendous different way. I took this like saying like a lot of folklorists get their information from men. I took that as they go on the men's description of a woman. It goes back to when we were having a discussion in class talking about Our Shadows Have Claws. It was literally about a monster. She was on the train in the Bronx. I forgot what train. I think it was the D train. But it was literally talking how she just wanted to be seen. Like, she was suffering and she just wanted to see. Like, for example, and I quote from this story, in your village, mostly everyone is suffering. So no one is able to spare a glance. But here, the people don't look at you because the easy thing to do, you don't mind. Meaning like, they just want to be seen. And not in the way or projected in the way that people are projecting them now. That's not how, personally, me, I would want to hear this. As a Afro-Latina woman and hearing all these stories and seeing the movies, I feel hurt that Hispanic folklores are really sexist, because it's such a shame, because there are stories out there like the four or five men I have mentioned in this podcast so far that their stories don't get told, but it's always the woman's portrayed as a monster. It's always women who are shown as a monster due to them being so, let me say, like, in a nice way, let me say, like, so, like, outrageous. Like, men back in the days said, like, they considered women as monsters because they could clean, they could cook, they could take care of the kids. This is back in the time, not modern day. And all on top of that, while also satisfying their partners, like, expectations of having food on the table by the time they get home from work. So I just find it extremely, like, crazy that men have this point of view of women being monsters, which relates to, like, La Llorona is such a sad story. Like, it's literally like her husband cheated. So because her husband cheated, she drowned her kids. And she haunts because she misses her kids and she wants to take any kid. Like, that story, literally, if La Llorona husband never cheated, who knows if we would have had this folk story of her. Like, personally, maybe men are the bottom line cause of why Hispanic folklores are so sexist, because it would make sense if, like, what I've read, that O'Connor quote, how she said, like, a lot of folklorists takes their information from men, how men have women described as men, which is crazy for me. And another thing she said in her article was that different methods of evaluations will be preferred, and that this volume is brought to us by women's folklorists from the United States. It is self-culturally, historically suspicious factor on appreciation of these details. The outdated production with sex roles. This quote clearly supports what I'm saying. How, like, due to the out-of-date, like, sex roles from back then that are coming into the modern day, which, yes, there are bending, yes, there are changing, but folklore hold this old idea of a woman, or an old idea of sexist roles, like how a woman has to clean, cook, like how, like I said earlier, how men prefer them as monsters because of the things they do, and how they're to be scared of them because they can handle so much more than men could. Wow, I could keep talking so much more on all these quotes I have found. My personal opinion, I find it crazy that as a Boricua who was born in New York and heard stories from my grandma, my mom, my aunts, how it's never men. It's always women and never men. And from people who I've talked to as told me, like, they only heard either one man's story, or, like, which a lot of them I believe do come in the Mexican culture, a lot of the men folklore. So, like, one of the Mexicans I've talked to saying how, she've heard of all of these men before, but I haven't. Or how I talked to one of my friends who's Peruvian, who she's like, there are some of them that she heard of, but majority of them was women. And I find that so awful. There should be times, especially now, they should go back and rewrite these stories or rewrite these tales. Yes, these tales are 100, even maybe 1,000 years old, but it doesn't hurt to go back and change them to put them into proper stereotypes. Some stories are meant to be shown in a female's point of view or about a female, but why won't people go back and write stories about men? More folklore stories, Hispanic folklore stories, should involve men. Because every woman's story, sometimes you hear a background about how men did this, how she was married to this, how she was perceived like this from a man. Why not now, since the 24th century, why don't we put it as, all right, let women describe men. Let's see How many Hispanic folklore stories could come from women describing men? From women calling men monsters? I feel like it'd be a great point of view to see a whole different side of Hispanic folklore stories. Mind you, that's just my opinion. That's what I would like to see nowadays, since everything is coming more modernized. But this is the end of this episode. Thank you for listening to Monster Stories, especially this episode on Hispanic folklore.
Hello, and welcome to Jose Talks, the show where we dive into the complex histories of global events. I'm your host, Jose Perez, and today we're going to be exploring the history and the impact of the U.S. embargo on Cuba. The U.S. embargo on Cuba in 1962, motivated by the Cold War politics and a desire to undermine Fidel Castro's socialist regime, had a negative impact on the Cuban economy, targeting a tragic fall during the special period after the collapse of the USSR, signifying its need for adjustments in a capitalistic direction. Let's begin in the 1950s. Cuba was under the rule of Fulgencio Batista from 1952 to 1959, a brutal dictator backed by the U.S. government. This relationship was rooted in the Platt Agreement of 1903, designed to protect Cuba's independence but also allowed U.S. intervention. That the government of Cuba consents to the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty, and for discharging obligations with respect to Cuba imposed by the Treaty of Paris on the United States, now to be assumed and undertaken by the government of Cuba. The Platt Amendment was a direct consequence of the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. emerged as the dominant force in the Caribbean. It reflects the area's imperialistic attitudes, ensuring U.S. interest in Cuba, particularly in sugar and other industries. But in 1956, everything changed. 82 men, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, landed on the coast of Cuba, sparking a revolution that would eventually overthrow Batista's regime. By 1959, Castro had established a socialist government, nationalizing American-owned assets without compensation. The U.S. response? A State Department memo from April 6, 1960, outlined a policy to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow the government. What makes this memo particularly significant is its straightforward acknowledgement of the intended impact on the Cuban people. The strategy wasn't about isolating a government. It was aimed at creating conditions so dire it would lead to the sharp decline in the population. This marked a significant turning point in the U.S.-Cuba relations, leading to a number of invasions and operations, all the way up until the embargo in 1962. In order to understand the full scope of the U.S. response to Castro's socialist revolution, we must dive deeper into Operation Mongoose, initiated in late 1961. Operation Mongoose was a series of covert actions approved at the highest levels of the U.S. government. This operation was a multifaceted campaign involving sabotage, psychological operations, and plans for assassination. The scale of this operation was unprecedented. It included a range of activities like propaganda broadcast aimed at undermining the Cuban government, its willingness to engage in acts that today would be considered acts of terrorism, including plans to blow up bridges, sabotage industrial facilities, and even stage false flag attacks to create the pretext for an invasion on Cuba. All of this was to create a hostile atmosphere to potentially win over the U.S. citizens to back the government in a Cuban invasion. After Castro's rise to power in 1959, the establishment of strong ties with the USSR, Cuba became heavily reliant on the Soviet support. This relationship was vital for Cuba's economy and military strength, and would soon be shown in the 1990s during the special period. A telling statistic from the Cuban platform states Soviet subsidized averaged $4.3 billion for a year, and during the period of 1986 to 1990, and constituted 21.2% of the Cuban gross national product. This substantial support, including the sale of below market value oil, which Cuba re-exported, was vital for Cuba's economy. However, the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 marked the beginning of a dire period for Cuba. They lost their primary source of imported food, machinery, and other vital commodities. In the midst of this economic turmoil, the U.S. tightened its grip with significant pieces of legislation, the Torricelli Act of 1992 and the Helms-Burton Act of 1996. The Torricelli Act extended the embargo's reach. It prohibited foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies from trading with Cuba, restricted travel, and limited monetary transaction. This act aimed to isolate Cuba not just from the U.S., but also from international trade involving American business. Then came the Helms-Burton Act. Title III states, "Protection of property rights of United States nationals. Make any person that traffics in property confiscation by the Cuban government on or after January 1st, 1959, liable for money damages to any U.S. national who owns the claim to such property." This clause expanded the embargo scope, affecting companies and individuals beyond American borders. This law allowed U.S. citizens to sue foreign companies and individuals profiting from property confiscated by Castro-led government. At its core, it sought to deter international investment in Cuba by creating legal liabilities. These two acts strained U.S. relations with allies and further isolated Cuba. Their impact was heard through the Cuban economy, already in shambles from the Soviet Union's collapse. Slowly but surely, Cuba began rebuilding its fallen economy. To understand Cuba today, we need to look at its workforce dynamics. In 2014, Third World Quarterly reported that 72% of Cubans were employed in state enterprises, a decrease from 83% in 2007. This shift signifies a gradual move towards a mixed economy model, blending elements of state-controlled with capitalist practices. This change reflects Cuba's response to the economic strains imposed by the embargo. The government has been compelled to adapt, seeking efficiency and productivity improvements in its economic structure, while maintaining its commitment to socialist principles. Healthcare is a cornerstone of Cuba's social policy. According to Stat News, with 11.2 million people, Cuba boasts the highest doctor-to-patient ratio in the world. This remarkable achievement is not just a reflection of their healthcare system, but also an emblem of their commitments to education and training. Cuba's medical diplomacy is another aspect worth highlighting. Approximately 25,000 Cuban doctors and 30,000 nurses work in 67 different countries, contributing significantly to the global healthcare. This initiative, apart from being a humanitarian endeavor, is also a vital source for revenue of the Cuban government, generating about $8.2 billion today. Education in Cuba from kindergarten to PhD is free. This policy underscores the government's focus on education as a fundamental right, ensuring a high literacy rate and an educated populace. The healthcare and education system in Cuba are bright spots in a landscape often overshadowed by economic challenges. The main reason these fields survived despite the sanctions was due to the government's ability to prioritize social welfare within a constrained economy, showcasing the benefits of communism. It's clear how the U.S. embargo on Cuba left a huge mark on the island nation. While Cuba's healthcare and education systems stand as testaments to the country's resilience, the broader landscape reveals the harsh realities of economic isolation. The embargo initially intended to destabilize the government has instead become a prolonged policy that over decades has significantly hindered Cuba's development. Its effects have far-reaching, touching every aspect of Cuban life, from food security to technological advancements. While the Cuban government has shown remarkable ingenuity in adapting to these constraints, the fact remains that the embargo has imposed undue hardships of the Cuban people. Now, to conclude the episode on a more positive note, Cuba has recently earned 7 gold medals in the last Olympics, including 2 in wrestling and 4 in boxing. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Cuba's challenging yet inspirational story. My name is Jose Perez, signing off.
So thanks again to our students for being willing to share their work and contributing to this special episode. Join us again in August when we'll share the audio from my 2023 New York Comic-Con panel, Comics in College, Pop Culture Pedagogy, and Fandom Final Projects. Beginning in September, Rojo and I will be back with fresh episodes. In our upcoming season, we'll be looking at speculative fiction in various forms of media, including short stories, podcasts, graphic novels, and film. In the meantime, let us know what you think. Share your thoughts with us. You can always reach out to us on social media or by email. Follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at Latinx Visions. Our email address is latinxvisions@gmail.com. Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Share us with your friends and family. And if you have a moment, consider leaving a 5-star review on either Apple or Spotify. It really helps listeners find us. All right, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Dale. Until next time.